What does a civilization fear most in war? Not always defeat. Sometimes it is the moment a weapon appears that seems to violate the logic of battle itself. A tool so unsettling that people begin to ask not only how it kills, but whether it should exist at all. Across the ancient world, long before laboratories, treaties, and modern military law, men stood on dusty plains, stone walls, and rolling seas, confronting inventions that felt almost unnatural. An arrow could carry more than iron. Smoke could become a kind of invisible assault. Fire, once wild and unpredictable, could be shaped into a deliberate instrument and sent across water like a living thing. Again and again, the battlefield became a place where ingenuity crossed into unease. What is striking is not simply that these weapons were deadly. War had always been deadly. It is that certain inventions seemed to wound the moral imagination as much as the body. They blurred old boundaries between courage and cunning, combat and contamination, victory and cruelty. A soldier might survive the clash itself only to die hours later from poison, infection, or flames that behaved in ways no one thought possible. In those moments, the fear was larger than one army or one empire. It was the fear that human creativity had found a new path, and that once discovered, it could not be easily forgotten. This is the story of those weapons. Not legends in the simple sense, but reflections of a deeper truth about history, that every age produces its own threshold of discomfort, its own line between what is possible and what feels permissible. And perhaps that is the real mystery waiting behind these forgotten machines and toxins. When people tried to ban them, were they rejecting the weapon itself or recognizing something more troubling in the minds that created it? What if the deadliest wound was the one that looked harmless? On the open grasslands north of the Black Sea, where the horizon could feel endless and the rider often mattered more than the fortress, Scythian warriors carried such a possibility at their side. Their weapon was not impressive at first glance. A small arrow, a narrow bronze point, a quiver light enough for a horse archer who lived by speed. But the power of the shot did not end at impact. Ancient observers wrote of a foul paste, carefully prepared and brushed onto arrowheads, a mixture born from venom, decay, blood, and time. The recipe sounded less like metallurgy than alchemy, as if the Scythians had learned to turn the invisible processes of corruption itself into a weapon. Imagine the scene after battle, dust settling, hooves fading into the distance. A soldier examining a wound so small it barely seemed worth fear. Then the hours passing, fever rising, flesh swelling, pain sharpening instead of easing. In a world without antiseptics, without any true understanding of infection or toxins, the injury must have felt almost supernatural. The arrow did not simply pierce the body, it was to leave behind a second attack, quieter and more patient than the first. The genius of the weapon was cruelly elegant. Scythian arrowheads were often barbed, designed to remain inside the wound or tear tissue when pulled free. The poison did the rest, not always quickly, but with a grim certainty that lingered after the battlefield had gone silent. Survival became less a matter of bravery than chance. To neighboring cultures, this method of war was deeply unsettling. It suggested that combat no longer depended only on force, skill, or visible courage. It could now be extended through contamination, through what could not be seen. And perhaps that was the deeper terror. Once death could be hidden inside a wound, how could anyone trust the difference between surviving a battle and merely beginning to lose it? Can fire be aimed like a spear? In the 5th century BCE, during the long and bitter struggle of the Peloponnesian War, that question seems to have taken physical form outside the city of Delium, where defenders behind wooden fortifications suddenly faced something far more unnerving than ladders or rams. The machine itself must have looked strange even before it was used. A long, hollow beam, a metal mouth at its front, bellows feeding air into a chamber filled with burning material. Then, in a burst, flame pushed outward with force and direction, not wild like a torch in the wind, but concentrated, guided, almost deliberate. The wooden defenses that had promised safety became fuel. In moments, architecture turned against the people hiding inside it. There is something psychologically different about fire when it can be controlled. Ordinary flames belong, at least in part, to chance. They leap, spread, falter, and depend on the weather. But a projected flame suggests intention. It transforms one of nature's oldest elements into an engineered decision. The defenders at Delium were not simply watching something burn, they were witnessing the possibility that human beings had learned to shape destruction with increasing precision. That may be why the moment echoes so strongly across history. The device was primitive by later standards, yet its meaning was unmistakably modern. It hinted that war was no longer limited to the direct collision of men and metal. Ingenuity itself had become a weapon. Air, pressure, combustion, and design were now part of the battlefield. The fire at Delium forced a surrender, but it also introduced a deeper idea, one that would return in many forms over the centuries. If a force as chaotic as flame could be harnessed and pointed at a target, then what other forms of destruction might one day be refined, contained, and released on command? And once that question enters history, it rarely disappears. What if the most dangerous weapon in a soldier's hand came not from a forge, but from a mountainside? In ancient Greece, among steep paths and thin air, a beautiful plant with violet blue flowers concealed a far darker purpose. It was aconite, later called wolfsbane, and in the wrong hands it transformed the ordinary arrow into something far more intimate and frightening. A wound from such an arrow did not always announce its danger. The cut might seem shallow, the bleeding might stop. The body might even keep moving for a while, as if the threat had passed. But the poison had already begun its quieter work, disturbing the nerves, unsettling the rhythm of the heart, turning the victim's own body into the site of a slow betrayal. Pain, numbness, weakness, confusion. Then the deeper unraveling. There is a particular unease in plant poisons. They remind us that the natural world is not only a source of healing, but also of hidden knowledge that can be bent toward harm. Ancient societies understood this well. The same landscape that offered herbs, roots, and remedies also held substances capable of ending a life without spectacle. In war, that ambiguity became morally charged. A blade was visible. A spear was honest in its intention. Poison altered the equation. It allowed death to arrive by delay, by invisibility, by a chemistry the eye could not follow. That is why these arrows troubled the Greek imagination. They seemed to violate an older ideal of battle as something direct and mutually legible. Even if war was brutal, it was expected to reveal its violence openly. Poison concealed its full power until after the moment of impact, and in doing so, it made combat feel less like a contest of strength and more like an argument with uncertainty. Perhaps that is what frightened people most. Not simply that nature could be weaponized, but that beauty, knowledge, and death could exist in the same flower, waiting for a human hand to choose between them. How much power can hide inside something small enough to rest in a palm? On a battered hill in what is now southern Scotland, the answer once flew through the air as a blur of lead, scarcely visible until it struck bone. The Roman sling bullet did not look like a weapon that could alter the rhythm of battle. It was modest in size, shaped like an almond, smooth enough to fit neatly in a pouch. Yet in the hands of a trained slinger, it became terrifyingly effective. A quick whirl of leather cords, a practiced release, and the projectile cut forward at startling speed. No thunder, no smoke, just impact. There is something humbling about the sling. It reminds us that ancient warfare was not always a contest of increasingly elaborate machines. Sometimes the decisive advantage came from mastering simplicity. Roman armies understood this with characteristic pragmatism. Lead was dense, easy to shape, and devastating when launched well. It could break skulls, tear through flesh, and reach defenders before they fully understood what was happening. The wounds uncovered by archaeology feel unnervingly familiar to modern eyes, as if centuries had briefly folded in on themselves. And yet the sling also carried a different kind of message. Many bullets were inscribed with taunts, names, brief phrases hurled alongside the metal itself. The projectile was not only ammunition, it was communication at high speed, a soldier's voice compressed into a lethal fragment. Even from a distance, war remained personal. That may be why the weapon lingers in memory. It shows how little separates ingenuity from violence when skill is involved. A strip of leather, a cast piece of lead, years of practice, and the human body becomes a machine of precision. No armor of rank or status could fully protect against that. Perhaps the deeper lesson is not that ancient people possessed hidden modernity, but that destructive efficiency has never required advanced technology alone. Sometimes it requires only patience, training, and the unsettling human ability to perfect what appears ordinary. What if the battlefield itself could be breathed in? In ancient China, military thinkers began to explore a disturbing possibility that war did not always need to strike the skin first. It could enter through the lungs, the eyes, the throat. It could move with the air. Picture a siege at dawn. The walls are crowded with defenders, the gates sealed, the narrow passages tense with waiting. Then smoke begins to gather, not the ordinary haze of burning wood, but a thicker, meaner cloud rolling toward the openings where soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder. Eyes sting, breath shortens, coughing spreads faster than commands. The body without permission turns against itself. That is what made toxic smoke so unnerving. Traditional weapons could be seen, anticipated, met with shields or distance. Smoke dissolved those instincts. It slipped through cracks, drifted around corners, entered enclosed tunnels and gatehouses where escape was hardest. It did not need to choose one target. It simply occupied the space people needed in order to remain alive. Ancient Chinese engineers, working through observation rather than modern chemistry, understood that certain substances release punishing fumes when burned together. Sulfur, mineral compounds, herbs, resins. In the right combination, they created not just confusion but weakness. In siege warfare, where movement was limited and fear could spread rapidly, that weakness became a tactical advantage. The defenders did not only lose visibility, they lost composure, coordination, and sometimes the will to hold their ground. What makes these early smoke weapons so striking is that they suggest a shift in military imagination. War was no longer only about impact, it was also about environment. Victory could come from changing the conditions around the enemy until even breathing became difficult. And once air itself becomes part of the weapon, a haunting question follows. If the most human act, the simple act of drawing breath, can be turned into vulnerability, then where exactly does the battlefield end? Can speed become its own form of power? During the fractured age of China's three kingdoms, when cities fortified themselves against betrayal and siege, one weapon suggested that victory might come not from a single devastating blow, but from relentless repetition. The repeating crossbow seemed to defy the natural tempo of ancient combat. Most missile weapons demanded a pause between shots, a breath of silence in which the archer reset the string, reached for another arrow, and aimed again. This device disrupted that rhythm. With a simple pumping motion, bolt after bolt could be loosed in rapid succession, as though the weapon had compressed time itself. Imagine standing below a city wall while defenders lean over the parapet. You expect one shot, perhaps two, before advancing again. Instead, a quick sequence of bolts rattles downward, forcing hesitation, then retreat. The weapon did not rely on overwhelming strength. In fact, that was its compromise. Its bolts were lighter, its range shorter, its penetrating force less impressive than that of heavier crossbows. But what it lacked in raw power, it answered with pressure. It denied the attacker a steady rhythm, and in war, rhythm often means confidence. There is something deeply modern in that idea. The repeating crossbow points to a change in military thinking, away from the heroic image of one perfect strike and toward the logic of sustained output. Keep the enemy pinned, keep them uncertain. Keep them reacting faster than they can think. Even if each individual bolt is limited, together they create a feeling of inevitability. That may be why the weapon lives so strongly in memory, especially when later tradition linked it to Zhuge Liang, the strategist whose name became almost synonymous with ingenuity. Whether he invented it or refined it matters less than what the association reveals. People recognize the repeating crossbow as more than a machine. It was a new philosophy of conflict. And perhaps that is the quiet revelation at its center. Sometimes history changes not when a weapon becomes stronger, but when it learns how to refuse the enemy a moment of rest. What if fire could chase you across the sea? In the 7th century, as enemy fleets pressed toward Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire answered with a weapon that seemed to belong more to nightmare than to naval warfare. From the decks of imperial ships, bronze siphons pointed outward like the mouths of strange animals. Then came the release. A stream of burning liquid arced over the water and struck wooden hulls, rigging, and sailcloth with terrifying force. The flames clung where they landed. Worse still, they appeared to survive contact with the sea itself, spreading panic as much as heat. Sailors who knew how to fight storms, ramming attacks, and boarding hooks suddenly faced something that seemed to ignore the usual rules of nature. Greek fire has endured in history not only because it was effective, but because it was mysterious. Its exact composition remains uncertain. Hidden somewhere between chemistry, engineering, and state secrecy, that secrecy was part of its power. The Byzantines did not merely wield a weapon, they guarded a monopoly of fear. Workshops, formulas, trained operators, imperial oversight. The knowledge was protected as carefully as the city it helped defend. And the setting mattered. At sea, fire carries a unique terror. On land, a person can run, roll, seek distance. On a ship, there is nowhere to go but into chaos or into the water. The vessel itself becomes a trap made of timber and rope. Once flames spread, discipline can collapse in moments. Men stop thinking strategically and begin thinking only of escape. What Greek fire reveals is something larger than a military advantage. It marks the moment when technology, secrecy, and psychological shock fused into a single instrument of power. The enemy was not simply defeated by damage. They were defeated by the feeling that they were facing a weapon from outside their understanding. And perhaps that is why the story still burns in memory. When a civilization protects itself with knowledge so potent it cannot be shared, it also risks losing that knowledge forever. What remains then is a strange legacy, a fire that once saved an empire and a mystery that outlived it. When does a weapon become frightening enough that people try to outlaw it? In medieval Europe, that question gathered around the crossbow, a machine so efficient that it seemed to offend not only armies, but the moral order those armies were built to protect. At first glance, the crossbow looked almost restrained. A short bow fixed to a wooden stock, a trigger, a compact bolt. But inside that simplicity was a dangerous shift in power. Unlike the longbow, which demanded years of training and a body shaped by repetition, the crossbow offered lethality with less apprenticeship. A soldier of modest background could learn to use it well enough to threaten someone armored in wealth, status, and steel. That was the deeper disruption. Medieval warfare was not only a contest of force, it was tied to hierarchy. Knights were not merely fighters, they were symbols of a social world in which nobility and battlefield authority reinforced one another. Heavy armor, horses, lineage, and martial education all pointed to the same idea, that some men were meant to dominate war. The crossbow unsettled that belief. A carefully aimed bolt could pass through mail, punch into flesh, and reduce years of privilege to a single instant. It is no surprise then that church leaders condemned it in the 12th century as excessively cruel when used against fellow Christians. The language of the ban sounded moral, but beneath it was a fear that technology had begun to flatten old distinctions. Distance, mechanics, and penetrative force were changing the emotional structure of combat. Honor no longer guaranteed safety. Rank no longer ensured survival. And yet the ban failed in the way such bans often do. Commanders kept the crossbow because it worked. Kingdoms kept it because their enemies would. Principle yielded to advantage, as it so often does in the history of weapons. Perhaps that is the quiet tragedy beneath the controversy. Once a tool makes power more available, society may condemn it, fear it, even curse it. But if it also proves useful, moral discomfort rarely stops its spread. It only records for a moment that people understood what had been lost. What if a weapon made without steel would still command the respect of steel-clad men? In the first encounters between Spanish conquistadors and the armies of central Mexico, that unsettling answer took shape in the hands of Aztec warriors carrying the macuahuitl, a weapon both elegant and brutal. From a distance, it might have seemed almost simple, a wooden body shaped like a narrow paddle, edged with dark blades that caught the light in sharp, uneven glints. But those blades were obsidian, volcanic glass fractured to an edge of astonishing sharpness. Embedded carefully along the sides, they turned the club into something between a sword and a saw, capable of opening flesh with a violence that surprised European observers. The macuahuitl emerged from a different material world, one in which metal was not the foundation of warfare in the same way it was in Europe. Yet scarcity did not produce inferiority, it produced adaptation. Aztec craftsmen understood what the land offered and drew from it a weapon of remarkable effectiveness. Obsidian was brittle, yes, but when newly shaped, it could cut with surgical precision. In motion, mounted on a strong wooden frame and used by a trained fighter, it became a fearsome instrument. There is also a cultural difference hidden inside the weapon. In many forms of Mesoamerican warfare, the goal was not always immediate death. Capturing opponents could matter as much as killing them. The macuahuitl fit that world. It could maim, disable, terrify, and dominate at close range. Its force was physical, but also symbolic. It announced a military tradition with its own logic, its own values, its own understanding of what victory meant. That may be why the weapon still feels so resonant. It resists the lazy assumption that technological history moves in only one direction, from primitive to advanced, from stone to metal to gunpowder. The macuahuitl reminds us that intelligence takes many forms, and that a civilization does not need to mirror another's materials to create something formidable. Sometimes the real surprise in history is not that a weapon was deadly, but that people underestimated it simply because they did not understand the world that made it. Can a bullet carry more than impact? By the 17th century, as gunpowder reshaped European warfare and muskets became common instruments of battle, that question began to trouble military minds with new urgency. A musket ball was already a brutal thing. It tore through flesh, drove cloth and dirt into wounds, shattered bone, and left surgeons working in a world where infection was often as dangerous as the shot itself. But some accounts spoke of something more disturbing: ammunition deliberately treated with poisonous substances. As if the violence of the projectile alone were not enough, the wound would no longer end with penetration. It would continue inside the body, hidden and hard to resist. Whether such practices were widespread or not, the fear surrounding them was real. And fear has its own historical power. Poisoned bullets seemed to violate an emerging boundary. Firearms were changing war quickly enough already, making death more distant, more mechanical, less bound to the rituals of face-to-face combat. To add poison was to deepen that estrangement. It suggested a form of killing that multiplied suffering after the shot, turning injury into a delayed sentence. That anxiety helped shape one of the earliest known agreements to prohibit a specific kind of ammunition: the Strasbourg Agreement of 1675. Negotiated between France and the Holy Roman Empire, it sought to ban poisoned bullets as weapons causing needless cruelty. In a sense, it was a small document with a large shadow. Behind its narrow language stood a wider realization that technological progress in warfare would keep producing choices that law and conscience could not ignore. What matters here is not only the treaty itself, but what it reveals about a changing age. Governments had begun to recognize that invention moves faster than ethics unless someone tries, however imperfectly, to draw a line. The line was fragile, enforcement was uncertain. War remained full of desperation. Still, the attempt mattered, because once human beings learn how to make a weapon more lethal, the harder task is rarely technical. It is deciding whether every possibility that can be built should also be permitted to endure. Why do some inventions vanish even after they change the world? History often gives us fragments instead of full explanations, and among the most haunting fragments are weapons whose methods survived in rumor longer than in practice. By the time later generations tried to understand many of these devices, the people who built them were gone, the workshops silent, the formulas scattered, the context broken. A weapon that once terrified armies could become a paragraph in a chronicle, an illustration in a manuscript, a cluster of artifacts lifted from the soil. The object remained, but the living chain of knowledge had thinned or snapped. What had once been practical became mysterious. This is one of the strangest patterns in the history of warfare. We often imagine military innovation as a steady climb, each age preserving and improving what came before them. But that is not how memory works, and it is not how civilizations survive. Knowledge depends on institutions, specialists, apprentices, stable governments, protected trade routes, and the quiet continuity of people teaching other people. When empires fracture, libraries burn, or political priorities shift, Even powerful technologies can slip away. Greek fire is perhaps the clearest symbol of that loss, but it is not alone. Poisons, incendiaries, engineered smoke, specialized projectile systems, all of them remind us that invention is fragile when it is too secret, too specialized, or too tied to a fading order. A weapon may be feared in one century and barely understood in the next. What disappears is not only technique, but confidence. The sense that someone still knows how to summon the force that once seemed unstoppable. There is a human lesson buried inside that disappearance. We are capable of extraordinary creation, but not always of preservation. We build tools that extend our reach, then discover that memory itself is easier to lose than power is to imagine. And perhaps that is why lost weapons continue to fascinate us. They are not merely relics of violence. They are evidence that history forgets even what once terrified it most. What do all these weapons leave behind besides wounds? Not just ruins, not just bones, not just the testimony of frightened observers. They leave a pattern, one that repeats across cultures and centuries with unsettling consistency. Again and again, the most troubling weapons were not rejected because they failed. They were feared because they succeeded too completely in changing the terms of war. A poisoned arrow turned time itself into an accomplice. Smoke transformed the air into an enemy. Fire crossed water. A mechanical bow collapsed the interval between one shot and the next. Even the simplest projectile, shaped with enough intelligence, could produce devastation far beyond what its appearance suggested. Each invention widened the battlefield beyond the obvious point of impact. And with that widening came a moral disturbance. These weapons did more than kill. They unsettled the stories societies told about honorable struggle, measured violence, and human control. Many of them blurred categories people depended on. Was the victim defeated in combat, or by chemistry, infection, panic, or secrecy? Was victory earned by courage, or by discovering how to make nature, environment, and time do part of the killing for you? This is why attempts to restrict certain weapons keep appearing in history, even when those attempts are inconsistent or incomplete. Long before modern conventions, communities sensed that some innovations threatened more than individual soldiers. They threatened the fragile idea that war, however brutal, could still be contained within recognizable limits. Once those limits eroded, conflict risked becoming something harder to govern and harder to morally explain. Perhaps that is the real inheritance of these forgotten arms. They force us to see that technological creativity and ethical anxiety have always grown together. Every civilization that invents new means of destruction must also confront a quieter question in the aftermath. Not only what can be built, but what kind of human being we become when building it begins to feel easier than refusing it. So where does this journey end? Perhaps not in the past at all, but in the uneasy space between memory and warning, where old weapons continue to speak in a language we still recognize. Across continents and centuries, these inventions emerge from different needs, different landscapes, different imaginations. A rider on the steppe, an engineer at a city wall, a sailor defending a harbor, a craftsman shaping stone sharper than steel. The details changed, but the pattern remained. Human beings looked at the world around them, at plants, fire, air, metal, pressure, and decay, and asked how each might be turned into advantage. The result was not only a history of war, but a history of thought itself, inventive, adaptive, and often profoundly unsettling. Yet what lingers after all the arrows, flames, fumes, and bolts is not simply the fact that these weapons existed. It is that people recognized their danger and tried, however imperfectly, to respond. Again and again, societies sensed that some methods of killing carried a cost beyond strategy. They threatened to make war less bounded, less comprehensible, less human. Even when bans failed, even when necessity overruled conscience, the attempt to draw a line still mattered. It revealed a truth as old as conflict, that morality does not disappear in war. It struggles there. Maybe that is why forgotten weapons continue to haunt us. They are mirrors. In them we see not only ancient violence, but a recurring question that returns each time technology outruns wisdom. We are always capable of building more than we are prepared to live with, and so the final lesson may be a humble one. History is not only a record of what humanity has made, it is also a record of what humanity has feared about itself. The oldest weapons still ask the newest question. When knowledge gives us greater power, will it also deepen our understanding or only widen the distance between what we can do and what we should do?